I'm Cynthia Marks, and I head up the Holistic Psychoanalysis Foundation, founded by my late husband, Dr. Bernard Bale. Welcome to And Now Love. Today, Erika Hartman is joining us. Erika joined Safe Place for Youth in 2021 as the Chief Executive Officer after 15 years in the nonprofit sector supporting people experiencing homelessness and underserved youth. She was formerly the Chief Program Officer of the Downtown Women's Center, a nationally recognized homeless services organization located in the heart of Skid Row. Erika has also been actively involved in legislative advocacy at a local and national level, testifying before Congress on the state of homelessness in Los Angeles and serving as a state captain for the National Alliance to End Homelessness. That's a lot of stuff that you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here.
We're so thrilled that you're here. And I think we met with Amy from the Downtown Women's Center.
Yes.
And that was terrific. So we're happy to find out that these connections exist amongst all of you. And I don't think that our community knows that you're all working so hard to work together. It's really so uplifting to know this and learn this.
Thank you. It really is a all hands on deck. We really need the cross system, cross sector folks from all different backgrounds to address a crisis of this magnitude. And people come from all walks of life who experience homelessness. So I tend to think of it as something like the ER, where there's so many different reasons that people find themselves there. And so we need lots of different strategies to help them exit homelessness.
Mm-hmm. And to think that you're all communicating with each other about how to best satisfy the needs of all those people with their individual circumstances.
Yeah, and I think that, the more targeted the approach to the population, the better the outcome. So like the Downtown Women's Center, serving specifically women, we really focus our efforts on young people ages 12 to 25 to implement strategies that sort of best meet their unique needs.
So let's talk about that. Thank you very much for serving this group of people. And it's hard for me to wrap my head and my heart around the statistics. So how many homeless youth in that age range approximately are there in Los Angeles right now?
Yeah. So the most recent point in time count found that there are approximately 3,000 young people experiencing homelessness on any given night in Los Angeles. And nearly half of those are young people who are spending each night sleeping on the streets. So real vulnerabilities that young folks experience and serious exposure to potential dangers, exploitation, things like that.
For these young people, the circumstances that bring them to living on the streets, is there a commonality or is it wide-ranging?
I think with young people, at the root is the lack of loving, supportive, caring adults in their lives. If they had someone who could have been there for them during these really hard moments, then they wouldn't be in the position that they are. And we see this in the form of young people who are coming out of the child welfare system. Something bad happened to them at home, and the system felt that they would be safer outside their home. But then there's nobody to continue the continuity when they technically become adults at 18. And, similarly, we see a lot of young people who identify as LGBTQ+, who, again, the people who one would hope would be there to support them in their lives, they've, have rejected them or have kicked them out of their homes. And so that's where Safe Place for Youth comes in, is to, be that community of loving, caring adults that stand with young people, that walk side by side with them through those challenges, and let them know that we're going to be here for them no matter what.
That's a giant task. So how many of you does it take to keep your operation running as beautifully as it does?
So we are approximately 120 employees across 9 sites. The sites provide different types of specialized services and different portfolios of housing. So varying lengths of housing, levels of acuity, and working with populations within our population, such as pregnant and parenting youth.
So, for example, then pregnant youth would be in one facility, one housing facility. What are some of the other groups that would then you have a devoted settlement for, let's say?
Yeah. So with our housing, we have varying lengths of stay. So for young folks who are immediately unsheltered, we have emergency shelters. We then work with them to move into transitional housing. So transitional housing tends to be about 2 years. We provide wraparound supportive services, help them stabilize through mental health, help them begin down paths of education, employment, so that after 2 years, they can move into their own housing and be stably, sustainably housed. And we do offer some of that type of housing. We call it time-limited subsidy, where the young person identifies affordable housing in the community. They are the leaseholder. We are sort of the guarantor that provides a security deposit that helps provide a couple of months' rent. And then we stay with those young people for up to 2 years, helping them stabilize, helping them find their path and their community. And then we step back and they take it from there.
That's pretty fantastic. That seems like getting to that point, there must be a huge effort on your part, on the part of your staff, to help people kind of not fall by the wayside.
Yeah.
Given all that they've been exposed to, all that they may continue to be exposed to if they're only able to get some of your services during the day and have to go back out to the street at night. To that, I wonder if you have this fabulous thing that's happening to you during the day, happening for you, which is such a blessing, but then you go back out at night, and you're faced with that fear, the possibility of being accosted, no food, cold. Is it 2 steps forward, 1 step back, I mean, is there enough light in the course of the day that people can say to themselves, I can make it through this night because I see that I'm making progress every day?
I completely agree with you that there is a challenge to, we are able to move people forward, but that they continue to face this real hurdle through certain parts of the day. And we were very fortunate in this last year that we received some support to extend our hours through to 7 p.m. and on weekends, because again, they do need that literal safe place. And I think what you're speaking to really emphasizes the importance of getting a roof over somebody's head immediately in order for their progress to be sustained. I think there's a lot of folks that want to see young people bootstrap it, get a job, and then get housing. And that's so hard to do if you have to stay up all night for safety, don't have a place to shower, don't have a place to leave your belongings. Showing up to an interview with backpacks and all your worldly possessions, like that's hard.
I mean, how you can't even get yourself to a doctor without having to think about moving everything you
Absolutely.
own.
Absolutely. So for that reason, at our drop-in center in Venice, we are very intentional about co-locating all those services. So we bring in partners like Venice Family Clinic to provide medical every week. UCLA Dental comes and provides dental on site. We have our own therapists, mental health support workers. We have our substance use counselor. Venice Family Clinic also provides psychiatric support. We have our education and employment programs. We can provide them with access to showers, laundry, meals, healing arts. So just really, again, trying to figure out, what is the unique support that each individual young person needs.
So how do you get these folks to trust you or find you? Is part of your staff out on the streets talking with these youngsters?
Yes, absolutely. A lot of the young people who come to us are referred by other young people who have received our services. And so we do have street outreach that goes out into the community and starts to build trust with young people just by being consistent, and that predictability is part of the trauma-informed care practice, is that young people know consistently that an outreach worker is going to come by and provide some meals, some water, hygiene products, and that that over time, they start to recognize those faces. And so when the outreach worker says, hey, come to our drop-in center, there's all these other resources there, and they've heard it from other young people, they have a level of trust. But we also, engage with the unhoused adult community. And a lot of times young people are referred by unhoused adults. Of course, community partners, we try to build relationships and be kind of a trusted, known entity in the community so that when law enforcement, community members, anybody who comes across young people needing support knows to refer to us. But I think what you said about trust is really important, and that's really part of what we talk about in terms of a youth-specific strategy, because young people have been failed by all these adults in their lives. People that at some point they probably did trust, and that ruptured trust can be so hard to rebuild. And so that's why it's really important with young people in particular to not ask them to immediately sign up for therapy or ask them immediately to give all their personal information, that we really have to show them that we are adults that are not going to fail them in the way that they've been failed before.
That's a big challenge on your part.
It is really something that I think even folks who have been in the homeless services sector, it's sort of a shift in mindset to work with young people. But, it can be really fun the way that we build that relationship. So a lot of young people just come for meals and the healing arts program in the beginning. So they come and they create, and then a staff person can say, hey, tell me about that piece of work. And by the way, where are you sleeping tonight? And the conversation starts to be more organic. We also employ a number of peer workers. So young people age out of our programs. They've completed, what they needed to be stably housed, to serve as mentors to other young people. And they can say, hey, that was my case manager. You can trust that person. And it makes all the difference in the world for a young person to see a peer who has, accomplished all the goals that they're working towards, and to be able to connect them directly to the folks that helped support them along the way.
That aspect, I think, is really cool. So you're sort of diminishing the possibility that there'd be a lot of resistance because you're an adult, that past trauma has created a situation for some of these individuals where you just are automatically not trusted. And maybe someone closer in age who's gone through it. So then part of your outreach team is people who have had some success in your program.
Yes, and that is something that we feel like as homeless service providers is a really important aspect of our work, is that we're also providing employment. So this is part of the way in which we provide the education and employment services, is to be an employer for these young people so that then they have their first job on their resume, they have a reference, we can be their address for them to, put on a resume. We provide some compensation for the period of time that they are doing. For example, we have sort of two tracks. We start with paid internships where young people can do 200 hours and learn some soft skills like showing up on time for work, resolving conflict with their coworkers or their supervisor. And then we also have some permanent positions for peer support workers. So it's kind of, an opportunity for young people to enter into the nonprofit field, to enter into homeless services. And so really just, again, trying to create pathways for whatever the need is.
And in your fabulous daytime services that everyone gets to partake in, what percentage of the people that get to enjoy, grow from that experience have to go back out onto the street? Or is your facility in Venice exclusive for the people that do need to go back out on the street?
Our site is open to any young person, whether they are experiencing street homelessness or at risk of homelessness. Because of the cost of living in LA, we can move people into housing, and then they still don't have enough money to potentially buy food or clothing or things like that. Above our drop-in center, one of our partner organizations operates permanent supportive housing. So they offer housing to adults and then also 20 beds for youth. And many of those youth, even though they're receiving subsidized housing, don't have enough money for laundry. The young parents don't have enough money for diapers. And so we continue to help provide those essential resources until they are able to take on those expenses on their own. But we offer 164 beds on any given night in our houses. And so but we see about 900 youth who come through our programs.
And 900 youth over the course of
a year, but unduplicated. So really significant number of young people in need. And, we, want to make sure that all our beds, all our houses are full, and that for young people that, we don't have a spot for, that we're looking for other partner organizations, other shelters where they can stay. We have some really incredible young people who are enrolled in college and maybe sleeping in their car. We have some UCLA students. We have Santa Monica City College students. We had a young lady who just graduated college and got enrolled in Teach for America. So I think that the possibilities are endless, and it's very much like young people who did have a loving, caring adult in their lives. These young people need all the same supports, and with that, they absolutely can thrive.
So then, speaking to that and mental health, that seems like a big challenge because as you first mentioned, that's a pretty intimate moment to put someone in, and someone who has been sort of shredded emotionally. What is the process to helping people come around to being comfortable with addressing their mental health issues?
Yeah. For young people in particular, it really often is something traumatic that caused their homelessness. So whether it was violence or abuse or family rejection, that kind of puts folks on a path even before they've ever experienced street homelessness. So, and then the experience of homelessness really compounds that trauma. And so certainly that gives real factors that we have to focus on as young people come into our programs, and, just keeping in the back of our mind that even somebody who is immediately jumping into employment, for example, that we still want to make sure there's that support in their background. But we really focus on lots of different types of non-traditional healing as a starting point. So we have a community garden where we also offer paid internships, the trauma-informed aspect of being out in nature in the sun. And, we offer this healing arts program where we do poetry writing, pottery, painting, all sorts of opportunities to create, opportunities for self-expression.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that our mental health program works is that our clinicians are engaging with young people as they're participating in singing, guitar, all dance, drumming, yoga, and that from there, that trust starts to build, and maybe they're seeing them every week and having a conversation, and then they can say, hey, do you want to schedule a weekly appointment? And we'll continue our conversation. And so sort of shifting what therapy looks like, instead of saying, hey, do you want to sign up to talk about your mental health diagnosis, that it's more of a, hey, this is the same type of conversation we'd be having. We'd be talking about your day-to-day, the challenges you're facing, the things that are getting in the way, and that it doesn't have to be heavy-handed, pathologizing judgment. It's just, we're here for you. And I think that that's essentially what, is provided by therapy in general, is ideally somebody who's really neutral, non-judgmental, again, consistent, predictable, has your best interest, the way a supportive parent might have.
Mm-hmm. Has to be that. There's no other way to do it in a healthy manner.
Yeah, for sure.
For example, let's say someone's become extremely expressive in the mode of dance,
Mm-hmm.
and a clinician is in that space watching the individuals who are partaking in that, and might sit down and have a conversation with someone and say, hey, I love how you went from A to Z, how there was this what appeared to be, feeling of sadness or overwhelmed, and then you went to this uplifting, happy space. Is that what you're feeling? I mean, is it just kind of a conversation about what are you up to, and how did you end up expressing yourself like this?
Yeah, and that's a safe conversation. So rather than asking about their trauma, you're asking about what they're expressing there. So
Mm-hmm.
it's sort of an entry point to maybe get to the same, what makes you happy, what makes you sad, sort of who are you, but it's not as personal, maybe feels invasive kind of questioning. It's like, these are things that you're putting out there so we can talk about them safely before I'm asking you for information that maybe you're not yet comfortable sharing. And young people really open up in that way.
Maybe more so than the rest of us older people.
Yeah. Well, even just things like our level of comfort maybe with dance or singing or putting ourselves out there,
Definitely.
that young people are like, all right, I'm just going for it.
Yeah. If you don't mind, can you share a story or two about the circumstances that brought a particular individual to you, and what they gained from their experience from you and what they're doing now?
Yeah. So there's a young lady who's part of our Spy Squad Youth Advocate. And, her background was going through the child welfare system. Unfortunately, she had, very abusive parents. And, we've heard from her about how she wished that there was a teacher or somebody in her life who could have seen that the reason for her behavior was what was going on outside of the school setting, for example. And so going through the foster care system, she felt very sort of pathologized and judged and, sort of labeled as the bad kid, when really this was her acting out and expressing her frustration with the rest of the world.
How old was she approximately when she entered into the foster care system?
She was about 14, and she had younger siblings as well. And that was also part of what was hard, was being separated from her entire family in that. But when she came to us, we were able to get her connected to our healing arts program. She specifically loves pottery and poetry, and she actually is now an employee, a regular full-time employee who teaches those classes. But I think going through these programs, she was able to start to find her voice. And so as part of Spy Squad, they do a lot of public advocacy. So going to the Board of Supervisors meetings and talking about, how the decisions that are being made by our elected officials are affecting young people. And so about a year ago, some of the county's public funding cut all the funding for youth homeless services. And we, really rallied our community, our supporters, our community partners, our board members, everybody, and especially the young people, to go and make public comment, to send letters imploring the Board of Supervisors not to cut this funding. But the most powerful voices in the room are the voices of the young people. And I think the Board of Supervisors was really moved by hearing their stories and how much it was going to impact young people to eliminate these types of really vital services. And in the moment, they restored 100% of the funding. And so that made all the difference in the world in what we have been able to provide in the last year. And what we've heard from this young person is about how it meant so much that her voice mattered and that she was able to shift that impacted so many other young people who had services in this last year that they otherwise wouldn't have. And so, we stayed connected to her. She's now a mother, and, she went through our internship program in the garden. And then when we had a peer support position, she applied. And so now she's able to, share her story and inspire other young people, connect them. And she creates this low barrier entry for them through her pottery and poetry class.
That is amazing.
She's a really incredible, inspiring young person for sure.
I feel like this idea of the individuals who have suffered the trauma of their experience coming forward and being advocates for themselves and others like them is kind of catching on.
Yeah.
In that it's our communities who decide our funding are really paying attention to the people who have a voice, who are offered the opportunity to speak on behalf of all these people. Do you see that?
Yes, and I think that there has, in our work in particular, been a real recognition of the importance of the voice of lived experience. In youth homelessness, we specifically say nothing about us without us. And I think that, again, not only is it that they are the experts in their own experience, but as adults, sometimes we have an idea of what's right for somebody or what we think their path should be. And that's not always right for everybody. And even if it is ultimately the path for them, it may not be right now. And so I think that it's really important for us to remain client-centered, youth-focused, and to hear from them directly. And in this Spy Squad program, the empowerment that they develop, they have really high rates of success in getting into housing and getting employment because they have that level of confidence. So it's like if you walk into an interview with a level of confidence, you've already, given yourself an extra leg up. And, people see that and they feel that, and it gives them confidence in you. And so I think that it's so important for them to feel like they matter, they deserve life, that's fulfilled, where they live out their goals and dreams, and building that throughout time is super important.
Well, we always say here on our platform that all of us as individuals, we are not the trauma that we carry. That does not represent who we are. It is just a thing that we have to do, we have to hold on to in order to survive.
Yeah.
And that the letting go of the trauma is so important, and to not feel like that is the sum total of who you are. To let people know that they're not that they are whole and that they have something to offer, and to know that they have a safety net is so huge. To be held in a world where you've never been held, I think allows us to then say, maybe I'm okay. Let me think about that. And then when I start to feel what is me instead of this horrific existence that was put upon me where someone told me I was the problem, what do I have to offer back? And when you start to offer back to any community that needs some help, I mean, it is just growth inside of you. And once you feel that growth and operate from that, then you're able to sort of give that gift to the next person. Like you're saying, you're advocates that go out into the community who can speak to the experience of the person they're talking to from their own experience is huge. Is huge. And if that's coming from the heart, which it seems like it is, and I think these youth are sort of more unfettered than those of us who have lived longer, that there's a way to get to that truth maybe more readily.
Yeah, I think what you're saying too is about don't let your trauma define you, that we're so much more than, what has happened to us.
Yes,
And
look how succinctly you put that.
no, I mean, I just super resonate with what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
For people in any background and any experience, like we have to remember that young people have been labeled in, whatever's happened to them before they're homeless. And certainly, that's part of why we've shifted the language to say experiencing homelessness is it doesn't define you. It's a part of your life, it's a part of your journey, but it's not who you are.
So then the idea of reunification with family, I guess maybe there are circumstances where family members who are clearly struggling themselves, if they've not been well enough to have the ability to love their children, they obviously need a lot of love and attention themselves, but there must be circumstances where that isn't happening. And the idea of reunification then is sort of off the table, yes?
And it super depends on that particular circumstance, because sometimes the trauma that a young person experienced happened outside the home, something bad that happened to them, but maybe they're coping with it through substance use. And at some point, maybe the family says, this is beyond us. We don't know how to navigate this. And so we can't have you here. And so once we've been able to work with a young person and maybe get them to where they can manage their, history of use, maybe they've achieved sobriety, then they can repair that relationship with a family member potentially. And so we can be a bridge. We do actually have a family reunification program for where that's appropriate for a young person. And we can provide some mediation with a parent. And sometimes it's that they ran away because there was a big fight, right? So like somebody didn't like somebody's boyfriend or girlfriend and, they ran off, and then maybe that relationship didn't work out, but now it's about needing to repair with the family. And so sometimes that's an appropriate path for young people. Sometimes reunification looks like finding a cousin in Florida and paying for a flight for a young person to reconnect. But for many young people, it's not an option. And so we need to have strategies, again, across the board, depending on what their particular circumstance might be.
And I think also something that you deal with that doesn't necessarily happen with an older crowd is that these are young little hearts and minds, and they don't have the adult equipment to handle situations properly. And so decisions are made that, are far from their better interest. And sometimes, I mean, I can imagine we can all speak from experience about things that we did as youth that you look back on and go, wow, if only I'd, had the maturity I have now, I would have made some different decisions.
Yeah.
So these youngsters are put in places where they're making decisions that are devastating.
Yeah, that, I used to work in the juvenile justice system. I was a sort of gang intervention therapist in my early career, and I would talk to community. I would say, can you imagine if you had to live by the decisions you made when you were 13, right? And some of these decisions can't be unmade. And so I think from a mental health perspective and brain development, a lot of young people still have a level of impulsivity. Their brains are still developing, and the reaction that they have in the moment might not have been the best option and maybe has big consequences to it. And so we're trying to, again, work with what they come to the table with. But some of the time it's just what happened in the moment. It was just a reaction. And so we have to navigate whatever perhaps the consequences of that might be. So, it's not that they're bad or incapable of recalibrating, but they made a mistake.
And sometimes we just, shame or judgment, we just stick by those bad mistakes because, you're too embarrassed to talk about it or undo it or figure out what would have been a better path. We spoke with a gentleman who is with Homeboys. He's a recipient of their services, and it's just what you're describing. He became a gang member at the age of 13. He had never experienced love in his life. He didn't really know what that was. He didn't have it at home. He was afraid to go home at the end of the day every day. And, the gang in his mind offered up love, what he thought was love. These people were going to take care of him. They were going to have his back. And you, by the way, are going to have our back. And so then there's this reciprocal thing. And he said it was completely, obviously, it wasn't love, but that guided his life. That guided his life and got him into huge trouble where, he ended up in prison for 30 some odd years. And, what a unique story in that he was able to navigate his way to being released rather than in prison for life and has established this beautiful life for himself. To me, it just speaks to what hopefully we're all capable of, that somewhere deep inside, and he did it pretty much on his own, which is crazy unique, that there's something inside of us, each of us, that's worth bringing to the world and more than worth recognizing.
We all have, that well of resilience within us, and it's just about how do we tap into that and bring that forward. And I think that with young people, especially, that, they're making these decisions that seem like the right choice at the time. And especially if you don't have a healthy model of love, then you're defining it based on what's in front of you. And if that's the first experience somebody has had where they felt like they mattered, then that might be how you come to define something until you realize that it does have some maladaptive decisions that are made around it. And I think that with young people who we see that are trafficked, for example, a lot of them believe that their trafficker loves them, and they are in their mind doing what they need to do to show that person love. And so again, if you haven't experienced a healthy model, then until you are able to identify, and it's really hard to go from feeling like this is love to then identifying this is not love, this is not what love looks like. And it does take that empowerment to say, I deserve more than this. And so yeah, I think that that's where, and the sort of the same characteristics that you're talking about with the gang, that's like, I'm going to be here for you, I'm going to care for you. That's what we're trying to do so that they don't have to turn to somebody who's going to be exploitative for that.
I think too that being in that situation where you've come to trust something to be love that really isn't, say in this trafficking scenario, when somebody suggests to you, I mean, you obviously have to handle this in such a timid way in order to make headway, but to have someone then look at that and think, well, okay, maybe I'm at a place where I can start to think about that. But what do I have without that? Even though you're telling me it's bad, and even though I now know it's bad, what do I have? What's going to act like love?
Mm-hmm. And this is sort of similar to when we're working with folks to let go of these maladaptive coping mechanisms like substance use, for example, is that we have to give them something to replace that we don't want them to have to just live with that hole or that loss that they've experienced. And I think that really that entry point is around helping people find sort of another path. And it's part of why people's journeys are so different is, how do you give people what they need to feel like they have the tools to manage, whatever feeling they're otherwise without.
Because the trauma for each of us is different. The circumstances are different. I think in our adult homeless population, there's a lot of mental health issues and a lot of people who need more help than, say, an agency like yours can give them. They need maybe full-time treatment of some sort. Is there a lot of that in the youth population?
I would say that it really depends on sort of what happened that brought them to homelessness and the length of homelessness that they've experienced. We know that 50% of the chronically homeless adults had their first experience of homelessness as a youth. And the longer you've gone in your life being unsheltered, for example, at the point that our young people are 30, they may have been homeless half their life. This is what they know, and it's the most recent thing for them. And so it can be much more challenging for them to really establish a new way of life when their experience of being housed was when they were so young. And so, like, at the point you're 30, remembering how you lived your life at 12, it just sort of, it wouldn't have lined up anyways, right? And so I think that unfortunately there's not as much in terms of resources for young people as there are for adults. And, of course, that's because the adult population is larger than the youth population, but the adult population is always going to be enormous until we start to deal with prevention and early intervention. And so there has been some change in legislation to go from doing more like local community mental health to more residential mental health, because the ability to deal with that level of trauma, again, people need to be indoors. They need to have, more robust supportive services. And with young people, that's sort of the age that something like schizophrenia emerges. And so, again, they're coping with a real lifelong diagnosis at a time when they have potentially the least amount of resources. And so it's a really critical entry point to preventing what most people see, which is the highest need, highest level mental health folks. Those are the folks that are the most visibly homeless because they are the hardest to support or they need the most robust supports. And there's just not enough of that. And so something like permanent supportive housing, where somebody is given essentially a voucher for life, they pay a third of their income towards that, but they're unable to necessarily re-enter the workforce. Folks with serious mental health challenges, serious physical disabilities, and we see that about 20% of young people qualify for that type of service. But for a lot of young people, permanent housing looks like stabilizing, achieving education and employment, and then moving into ultimately affordable housing. But if we don't intervene early, then we're looking at needing to house people in these really high acuity settings.
As you said, if we don't address what's happening with the youth will soon be 30, 40, and still living on the streets.
Absolutely.
So the individuals then, let's say there is a young person who is dealing with something like schizophrenia, and they're on the street and they're sort of beyond your services. Are you saying there's not really much available for them?
It's much more limited in terms of what is youth specific. So a lot of the young people that we serve, we serve young people that are as young as 12, but all of our housing is really for folks who are technically adults who are over the age of 18. And so if somebody's 18, they can go into an adult mental health facility, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to get services that are going to engage them in the same way, right? Because the system's been designed around the majority population. And so there's not a lot of youth specific high acuity mental health. So sometimes we do have to connect them to those adult systems. But if we can get them perhaps stabilized on medication so that they can receive other services, then we can help them get on a sort of more standard path out of homelessness. But it's that stabilization. And it's hard for somebody who mostly works with adults sometimes to stabilize a young person whose needs are very different.
And there are people who unfortunately can't really deal with life on their own that may need care forever. And a lot of those people are living on the streets.
Yeah. And I think that folks have sort of varying knowledge about how mental health evolves. But I think one thing that's really important for folks to understand is how trauma can reshape people's brains, and sometimes permanently. And when you're young, your brain is developing and creating all these synapses, and over time it gets shaped. And so like when all this brain development is happening, when trauma happens in those early years, it is really creates a bigger impression on the brain and can be much harder to regrow the brain in a different different direction. Again, that's why this early intervention in trying to catch people before they fall into homelessness, change systems that, contribute to homelessness. We have a legislative policy advocacy umbrella of our organization. We added advocacy to our mission because really we have to look at how public policy is actually harming our communities and contributing to these issues. So again, every stage of prevention is really necessary if we're going to address this crisis.
So, what is an example of a policy that is doing harm?
Well, a lot of what happens with child welfare and the juvenile justice system, for example. So when I was doing juvenile justice work, young women who were being trafficked were being criminalized, and they're recognized as minors, and we're saying, okay, they're not able to make the decisions of full-fledged adults, and yet we're holding them to the consequences as if this was a decision for them when there's an adult somewhere that's exploiting them. And so some of those shifts in policy that are not criminalizing in the same way have made an enormous difference. Again, like even if somebody gets out of the life of having been trafficked, they now have a record, they now have a stigma, all the things that come with that, all the trauma from that experience. And so I think that part of that is about educating the public so that they can use their voice and their vote. And then part of it is also about, providing this information to legislators. So we do, again, have sort of public meeting advocacy, and then we also try to meet with our legislators on an individual basis. One of the things that our system is facing in the immediate, youth homeless services in particular, is major funding cuts at the local, state, federal level. And so a lot of our advocacy right in this moment is around preserving not just funding for homeless services, but specifically for youth. And one of the really incredible things about how the state handles its funding is that it sets aside 10% of state funding for homelessness for youth. And so that, as long as if funding is being cut, there isn't a possibility that youth won't get served. It might be less funding, but we know that there will be a pocket for youth. And so that kind of advocacy is really important. We call that a youth set aside. And so we continue to try to work with our local elected officials to ensure that they are also guaranteeing that there will be youth specific services, even if the system is under resourced or, facing a cut in resources. So things like that.
Yeah, so that's fantastic, while difficult because you won't have as much funding as you like. And is it easy enough to access those funds, or are there all sorts of hoops? And
There are lots of hoops. Yeah. I think that initially, even just qualifying for that type of funding, in order to provide housing, you have to have experience providing housing. And so,
gosh.
yeah, so you have to, you have to find something essentially where private philanthropy, kind-hearted community members will support a service like that before we can even apply for funding for a service like that. And so, something like that is a hurdle. One of the enormous hurdles that we face is the length of time it takes to reimburse for services. So often we're floating our expenses for an extended period of time in which we're not able to receive reimbursement. So that puts a pressure on an organization to have cash flow to be able to continue to operate, because we can't go 3 months and not pay our staff and not pay our bills. We need, especially public funding to pay us on time in order for our sustainability.
There's a whole bunch about what goes on behind the scenes. It's just nothing but tedious. That's an absolute necessary giant step in the process.
Yeah. And public funding is super needed, right? Like a crisis at this scale, we can't ask, private philanthropy, corporate philanthropy to cover all of these costs. Like we absolutely, in order to scale, need public money. But for our purposes, it's super important to have diversified funding streams because there's so much inconsistency.
So these days, are you having to do a lot of work to speak to private donors?
Yeah, we have a real push in this moment to engage our community who cares about these issues and to inform them about what's happening, because I think what is really going to happen in Los Angeles is people are going to see more visible homelessness as services go away, and they don't necessarily know why, and they attribute it to the efficacy of the service provider, for example. And so, we really want people to understand that this is the challenge, and if this is an issue that somebody's been thinking about supporting, now would be a really good time to invest in this cause and to invest in our young people, because our ability to access public dollars is shrinking. And at the city level, the county level, everybody's facing budget deficits. And so can't squeeze water from a stone. So, we are pushing as hard as we can for those public dollars, but really imploring our community to help us out in this time and know that we will continue to seek public dollars, but that there are going to be real gaps in funding.
And I hope that part of what we can achieve here is undoing some of what is a stereotype about the homeless situation, because most of us aren't really involved in doing something to help this group of people who are part of our community. We just drive by and look at them and go, "Arr," and that's not helping. I want to bring to light that there are so many organizations like yours that are coming from a place of passion and empathy, and can hear in your voice how urgent it is that if we don't really get to this funding, that more people are going to fall by the wayside. And when it happens to our youth, my gosh, I mean, we can just think about our own children, but I feel like there's so much valuable work being done and that so much is being dismissed. I mean, yes, we aren't doing our best to support the homeless issue at large, but many of us are doing fabulous things, and we need to grow that light and give it more presence. So thank you for helping make that happen.
Thank you. I mean, this is how we get this word out to the public about sort of what's going on. I want to think that it's a universal truth that we all agree that young people deserve love and care and that people can get behind that. Of course, everybody's different, but if people can hear that, this is a social value, that we assume that adults are going to take care of young people, that these are young people in our community who need us too and need the same love and care and support that housed young people need as well.
So when you have someone who comes to you and you're able to give them help, who's 12 or 13, and they cannot go into your housing system, what happens? What is your goal for those people?
We start by trying to find them an immediate placement for the night, because at the end of the day, when we close, if they don't have a safe placement, we have to turn to the child welfare system for support. And that's a really mixed bag, because there are young people who can't safely return home, and we understand that. And then we also understand that the child welfare system is completely overwhelmed with need and spread incredibly thinly. And so it can add an added barrier to young folks after they've gone through that experience. So for whatever we can, we explore with them, who are the people that support them in their life, even if it's not a family member, if it's a friend, for example, can we get their parent to consent to letting them stay with somebody for a period of time, maybe till things cool off. Maybe there's, more extended family they can stay with. There were some minor shelters that would allow minors to go into them for 90 days, and that, there was a little bit of a bigger window to find a safe placement for them. And unfortunately, those were largely federally funded. And due to federal funding cuts, due to the barriers to applying for federal funding at this point, those are largely closing in Los Angeles. And so that's going to put the added burden on the child welfare system, and it's limited our options for those young people. So it becomes an even more urgent situation the day they walk in to try to find that placement, because we only have till the end of business to find them a safe place for the night.
And if a child doesn't find that safe place for the night and they end up in the welfare system, what is kind of a typical scenario for one of those kids?
Yeah, I think a lot of people think that, they're going to go into a loving, caring adoptive family. At the point that they're not babies, they often end up going into group homes and end up staying there until they become legal adults. During 2021, there was federal pandemic relief funding that allowed young people to remain in care past the age of 21. But when that funding suddenly ended at the end of 2021, there were a number of young people that had absolutely nowhere to go. It didn't change for them that they still didn't have a housing placement. And so our colleagues in the child welfare system reached out to us and just said, is there anything you could do? Could you act as a fiscal agent to administer payments to their foster parents? Well, they don't have foster parents. They were in group homes. And so what ended up happening is the group home said, well, we're sorry, we can't take them. We have wait lists of people who are coming in. And so we said, okay, we're going to stand up an emergency shelter. And in 2 weeks, our team just absolutely rallied and stood up this 30-bed had shelter, and we moved the remaining young people who didn't have housing placements into there.
What a feat.
It was a big lift on the team and also so worth it. The fact that we were able to keep so many young people from experiencing a single night on the street, that's the kind of stuff for, as heartbreaking as this work can be at times, that it just feels like, okay, this was a good day to show up. Like, this was a really, really important day. We really have to celebrate all the wins, because we know that there are moments that are really hard in this work.
Well, I think that you must have a lot of wins to celebrate. You've been doing this for a long time and clearly doing it well.
Thank you.
What about this work excited you? How did you end up being so passionate about this?
So my background is as a marriage and family therapist. I originally thought I was going to do private practice and the whole thing. And as I was in school, I had family members that were really struggling, who were 12, 15, 16. Some of them ended up finding family in gangs, for example. And I was a college student, and I was like, okay, what am I going to do? How am I going to help? And I was like, I just don't feel equipped to do this. Like, I'm not, I wasn't totally supporting myself. I was lucky enough to have parents that were supporting me, and, I couldn't take in a 16-year-old, and I didn't know how to support somebody in exiting a gang. And so when I was in graduate school, I specifically sought out internships to learn about what resources existed for youth who were experiencing that. And so that started kind of my trajectory into working in gang intervention and juvenile justice. And then from there, I went to work with the child welfare system. So seeing all this overlap, many of these group homes house both youth in the juvenile justice system and youth who are in child welfare. And so it's just it's an incredible mix of challenges that go on. And so I had kind of exposure to all these things that were pipelines to homelessness. And as I was seeing homelessness, across Los Angeles just skyrocket, it was really just sort of a feeling of overwhelm to pull up at a stop sign and see somebody who you can see is in physical pain. And you can give them some basic needs resources, and you can give them money or, whatever you have available, water. But at the end of the day, they're still going back to a tent, and they're out there tomorrow. And so I felt like, okay, well, what skill or ability can I contribute to this? And I think that that's also something that's important for the community to know, is that whoever you are, wherever you are, that there is a role for everybody, even if it's just educating another person, educating yourself, helping people shift the narrative around homelessness, myth busting. It doesn't have to be necessarily, if you don't have things that you can, give physically, that there is all this other opportunity to volunteer, to be a mentor, And so I think for me, I was like, looking at this from the perspective of, okay, I have an understanding of this population, I have an understanding of mental health, experience in nonprofit, and then how can I translate that to making the biggest impact? And so I sort of moved from direct service into supervising gang programs, into chief program officer role at a child welfare agency, then chief program officer at Downtown Women's Center. When I had the opportunity to go to a safe place for youth, it was really bringing all that experience together. I truly believe that it's our responsibility as a society to support these young people. And so I have a lot of passion for this work, and it feels personal to me because, I've seen it firsthand in my own life. In all the young people that I've gotten to know, they're brilliant, they're resilient, they're so incredible, such incredible senses of humor too. I think humor is kind of a survival skill. And so it's been really rewarding. And I feel like I learned so much from them, and it gives you real perspective about if they're facing what they're facing and they're triumphing, then I feel like I owe it to them to show up, and it gives me perspective on when I have a hard day, because I know it's nothing like what they're experiencing.
Yes. Listen to Erika. This is exactly what we would hope all of us would, come to on bigger, smaller levels, but we all have something to give. And this is humanity. It's humanity. And part of our job as humans is to really help each other, to step up and help each other.
Yeah.
And you're right. It might be that you can't physically go to a location and do something, but you can speak up. You can talk about the issues. You can, like you say, change the mythology.
Yeah, and the more that people know and they're educated in their vote and how they approach that, there really is something in everybody's personal lives, because this is a societal issue, and so it is, how do we shift ourselves as a society to deal with this?
I mean, we all see it. We all know it
Yeah,
exists.
yeah. It affects everybody in LA, and it's not good for the unhoused community, of course, but it's also not good for the housed community. And so that's where I think for me, it's about where do we find a common ground? Because we do find community members that don't want homeless services providers in their community. And so we really try to hear their concerns and commit to doing everything possible to address their concerns and also help them see that we're really trying to address the issue that was there anyways. It was there before we were there. And at least, there is some incremental progress that's happening by us being available to be in their community and support.
Right. You're providing a path to change that wouldn't happen if you weren't there. So how do we find you and help you? Where can we see your website and find out more about what you do? If somebody wants to give on any kind of level, what would that look like?
Thank you. Thank you for asking that. Our website is safeplaceforyouth.org. There's a tab there that says Get Involved, and we have a bunch of different ways that folks can support the work, continue to learn about youth homelessness. We invite the community to come see our sites. I think that when you really see the young people, it really, again, shifts the perspective when people can see it firsthand. And if not possible, again, there's other opportunities to learn. Of course, people who want to support the work through in-kind donations or monetary donations, we're incredibly grateful.
Especially now.
Absolutely. But yeah, there's all things that are needed. We have wonderful folks who come and serve the meals. And I think that young people encountering community members who look them in the eyes and treat them with a level of humanity that maybe they've not been treated with, that helps build their self-esteem. That helps them remember that they're worth it when they feel like the world is telling them something different.
That's so lovely. And to be the person helping and to be able to look that troubled person in the eye and see a little glimmer, I mean, that's pretty heartwarming too.
Absolutely, yeah, It is.
Well, thank you. Thank you again for being here. I know you're so busy and what you're doing is just precious, really, and that you come from so much experience and passion about helping this particular group in need is something the world desperately needs. We need more of you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for uplifting this issue. And you're giving us a platform to give young people a voice.
Well, thank you. Happy to do it.
Thank you so much.
Please follow, rate, and share our podcast and pass this episode along to someone who might need it. This is And Now Love. Listen to your dreams and live from your heart.